Now, I want to show you guys actually a quite nice little puzzle that takes advantage of this rule of the square, exploits this to white's advantage. So let's see that now. So in this position here, white is apparently in trouble at first sight. And the reason for this is because if white plays the move pawn to a4, black will now go king to e4. Pawn to a5, black will go king to d5, pawn to a6, king c6, a7, king b7. And this is very problematic for white because if white attempts to go after this pawn, he cannot go immediately after this one. Well, this will take him a very long time. And so in this position, he's actually already losing. In the original position right here, even after the first move a4, king e4, white can still draw this by a5, king d5, and now just king e2. And then by the time that black goes off to collect the outside passed pawn, then what white can actually do is he can break this pawn structure by playing even a move such as king to e4, and after king takes, then pawn to d5. And let's say pawn takes, king takes. Clearly, this f7 pawn cannot be saved. The black king is too far away. So it would be a draw if white continued this way. However, in the starting position, white can use his knowledge of the rule of the square to his advantage. The reason why pushing the pawn to a4 does not succeed is because if we now draw the square, we see that it runs from a4 to a8 to e8 to e4. And black, it being his move, is just in time to get into the square. Now, if white plays a5, king d5, he is once again in that square. a6, king c6, a7, king b7, and we see the problem. However, in this position, white has a very, very clever idea. He pushes the pawn to d5. Now, black has to accept the sacrifice because if he does not, then the pawn will just run forward. So, therefore, he accepts and plays e takes d5, and now white plays a4. So once again, we draw the square. Now black can of course go into the square, but after a5, the square changes. We now have the following square. And that d5 pawn, we begin to understand why the pawn was sacrificed. Black's only way of getting into the square is to play the move king to d5, but of course the pawn is standing in his way, and therefore white wins. So that is an example of what may appear to be a very advanced chess study, but in fact it's based on an understanding of what is a very, I think, quite simple rule, which is this rule of the square. I'm now going to show one more example, which is a very famous study by Reti. Some of you will know him as one of the old great masters, and we will revisit this rule of the square. So let's check that out now. So this is a very clever puzzle created by Reti, and the point is that we learn a couple of things from this. The first is that pawns that wish to advance, we want to support them with a king whenever that's possible. Right here, it looks to me like black is in really, really good shape because the white pawn appears to be under very, very easy control by black, whereas the black pawn, which is racing down the board, seems to be just completely beyond the reach of the white king. But appearances can be deceiving. White actually here plays the move king to g7. And believe it or not, this position is a draw. Why? Well, black has a couple of options here. He can either play king to b6, or he can push the pawn to h4. Pushing the pawn to h4 would seem like the most natural move. Now, white goes king to f6. Now, in this position, once again, black can play king to b6 or can push the pawn. Let's assume that black pushes the pawn. Well, in this case, white can now play the move king to e7. Now, what we've seen is we've seen the white king beginning all the way at h8 and so far away from the c-pawn. Now, suddenly, it's quite near to the c-pawn. So if king b6, it's now too late. King will go to d7, support, and promote. And if black goes h2, then after c7, black promotes first. That may be so, but white promotes just in time. And this, of course, is just a draw. Maybe queen b7, queen takes, king takes is a very clear draw. Well, what happened here? I guess that black should, instead of playing h3, play this move king to b6. But in this case, white now plays the move king to e5. This is an extremely clever move. Now, if black were to capture the pawn on c6, well, what is the square for the black pawn? It runs like this. So clearly, white is in time to prevent the pawn from promoting. So therefore, we have to take a step back. And in this position here, after king to b6 and king to e5, black should push the pawn to h3. The problem there is king goes to d6, h2, pawn goes to c7. If king b7, then king d7, and I will promote with check. h1 queen, c8 queen, and once again we have a draw. So here to play king to b6 will not get the job done for black. So after king g7, perhaps he should play king to b6 immediately. Well, now white will go king to f6 regardless. Now white has the threat of king to g5, so black must push. And now white plays this move king to e5. Now we see that if white were to play king g5, then black would just play pawn to h3 and the pawn cannot be stopped. But by using the very special geometry of the chessboard and combining the rule of the square with the desire to support this pawn, white actually is able to very cleverly save the game. He's able to zigzag and seemingly go away from the pawn. Yet at the same time, the difference is huge because from a square like e5, he can step not only to f4, but even to e4. And this square will be good enough as well, because if we see, the rule of the square means that getting anywhere from h1 to e1 to e4 to h4 is going to mean that the pawn can be stopped. So that is very, very important example. Now, once again, if pawn to h3, white will play king to d6, and he will be there in time to promote. So that is the rule of the square. Absolutely essential knowledge for chess endgames, and of course, just a very, very clever example of using the rule of the square in combination with supporting a passed pawn, which is another very important principle in king and pawn endgames. We began this series commenting that an extra pawn in king and pawn endgames is usually very easily converted. So we're going to end the series now with me just saying, be very, very careful if that extra pawn is either an A pawn or an H pawn, because rook pawns have very different properties. The fact that the black king does not have two files to potentially move to, but only one, he can move to the G file away from the H file, but there is no I file, right? So therefore, this fact makes it possible for white to imprison the black king in a position such as this. So white can go, for instance, with the move king to f2, and black can only go to h1, and now white simply drops the king back to f1. You know, if chess was played on a 9x9 board, black would just play king to i1 or king to i2, and from the I file, he would help the h-pawn to promote. But he is very, very much stuck for squares here, and so the only thing he can do other than shuffle the king back and forth between h1 and h2 is to play the move pawn to h2. But here he only leaves himself even more restricted, and after king to f2, white actually stalemates his opponent, which suits white just fine. And we have a draw. Now, what I want to show you is that even if we reverse whose move it is here and we give the move to black, even then the position will be a draw. Why? Because now black has only two options, king to g3 or king to h1. Now, if king to h1, then after king to f2, we have the same scenario once again, shuffling back and forth, and if you play h2, then king f1 is stalemate. However, if the black king steps onto g3, white will now go king to g1. And from here, the white king will just shuffle back and forth between g1 and h1 until eventually black will get tired, push the pawn to h2, give a check, king goes to h1, and now black is either forced to play a move like king f3, after which the pawn falls, or king h3 is the only square from which he can continue to defend the pawn. But here we see that it is black who has stalemated white. So technically this isn't really something that is a principle or part of a plan, but I just wanted to make sure that you guys are very clear on this, because otherwise the comment that I say about when you have an extra pawn in a king and pawn endgame, you're usually going to be able to convert it quite easily, may seem like a little bit of a lie if I don't point this out. Anyway, that is it for this section. We have touched upon some very important points. We began by discussing the value of the outside passed pawn. We mentioned this 3 pawns versus 3 pawn situation afterwards, where if the pawns advance too far, then they can break through with this b6, and you sacrifice a double pawn sacrifice just to create a passed pawn. The third thing we discussed was the rule of the square. That is absolutely a critical rule. We then saw a very nice puzzle where white sacrifices a pawn on d5, if you recall, just to be able to block black from accessing the square. Then afterwards, we looked at this beautiful composition by the great master of the past, Richard Reti, and he showed that by some miracle, white is able to catch up to this pawn when things look very, very grim. And that's an important one because it uses the rule of the square that we learned, and it also shows that in endgames, we really want to use our king either to hoover up our opponent's pawns or to guide our own pawn towards promotion. As I imagine you already knew before this section, in king and pawn endgames, promotion is the number one aim of the sides, and very often sacrificing 1, 2, or even 3 pawns is perfectly fine if you can justify it by actually promoting much sooner than your opponent. And finally, we finished off the video with this jail and stalemate examples of rook pawns. So that's also something very important to keep in mind whenever trying to build a good game plan in the endgame. So hope you enjoyed this, hope you found it valuable, and I will see you guys in the next video.